among them, as we have seen, whose existence and entire characteristics may not be accounted for by reference to purely mundane causes, and which is not perfectly similar and analogous in all its elements and features to events which do not result from such causes. All these manifestations in the next instance will be admitted, and with the most absolute logical consistency, the claims of spiritualism to ab extra spirit origin denied. So ad extra is, beyond the extra, like in other words, an extra spirit having to be there to cause it. So these can all be done without any reference to a spirit or to witchcraft, and they cannot be explained by trickery. We will contrast a few miraculous phenomena revealed in the Bible with some claimed to be of a similar character connected with spiritualism. We will begin with the leading miracles. It is well known that there are certain peculiar forms of disease which can sometimes almost instantly and others in very short periods be cured by the imagination or certain medicines. There are others which cannot be affected by such causes. Of the former class exclusively are the healing phenomena of spiritualism. So it can heal certain things, just like the mind can heal itself of various diseases without spiritualism by having faith that it's been cured. The placebo effect, or the faith healer, and a lot of times too, a lot of those self-healings are temporary because the cause of the problem is stress related, and the person's all in excitement and they've dropped their stress, and so the problem has gone away. Like some people that are so uptight, they're going to develop headaches, and but if they can actually let go of the cause of their stress, then they can let go of their stress and they feel a lot better. So it can have a pretty, medically speaking, that's obvious to pretty much almost everybody, I think. So there is a certain level where things can happen that are extraordinary, but they're not metaphysical. Well, however we define the word metaphysical, beyond this physical, this is kind of a gateway between the physical and the non-physical, but the point is, this is all part of what we would call regular science, and not miraculous. So the healing medium by his passes may, through the imagination of the subject or through the medicinal influence of the odalic force thus excited in the patient, affect certain forms of cure. Over other diseases he has no power for good. Thus he may make as many passes as he pleases over a corpse, and he can never reanimate it with a living soul. He can make no approach whatever towards restoring to a maimed person his lost limb. Yet there are among the most prominent of mighty works performed by Christ in the sacred writers. These last are among the most prominent works performed by Christ. That exercised by Jesus Christ had an equal and absolute efficacy in respect to all diseases of every kind. In connection with this fact, he did what the medium can make no approach whatever towards doing, that is, restoring lost limbs to the maimed and raising the dead to life. The power then, which originated in the scripture miracles, supposing them to have occurred, differs not in degree but in kind from that claimed in behalf of spiritualism. I'm not saying that it's impossible for the dead to rise as a Christian miracle today. And of course you're going to find people that are always going to say, we had this non-Christian miracle of rising from the dead, and that I have yet, to see, and I've looked into a lot of different claims before I became a Christian and afterwards, and I take everything, like I said, going into this subject for me is showing my openness, because it's easier just to say, oh, well, just ignore it all and say it's not possible and just believe, my Christian religion or something. But my religion is the religion of truth, wherever it comes, and I have found that Christ is the capital T, the truth, and he is God manifested in the flesh, and I have sufficient reason for that, not just in evidence, but on an ongoing evidence relationship knowledge as well. But it's vastly important that we distinguish kinds and degrees of evidence, and we don't overbelieve or underbelieve things. And that's what he's doing here. It's an exercise of that. The same remarks are equally applicable to the spirit of prophecy. Suppose that we have two classes of predictions, each 100 in number, relating to events which lie equally beyond the reach of mere human foresight. Of one class, but one is the whole of one class, but one in the whole 100 is fulfilled in any form. Of the other, not one in the 100 fails in any particular. What higher evidence can we have that the intelligence which originated the latter class differs not in degree, but in kind, from that which originated from the former? So we have people predicting, and they get it. And to give you more context, in my early Christian life, I went to various leaders to find answers. And one of them I went to look for inspiration was this guy, David Wilkerson, The Cross and the Switchblade book. And he seemed to be some godly man, according to the people that I was influenced by at that time. And he wrote a book on prophecy, or about a prophecy, and was warned not to publish it. And he prophesied that all these events were going to happen, and only a few kind of happened that were relatively easy to predict. And I was really stumbled as a young Christian by that. So it's very relevant to mention this at this point. It's not going off, because he was a charismatic, and he engaged in that kind of over and under believing things, and in his regular worship, I guess you could say, and yet I wasn't very familiar at that point of that aspect of Christianity at that point, or of what happens in some Christian circles, I should say. And so when I read his book, which was actually years later, after he wrote it, but I was still a young Christian, and I came across this, I was really stumbled by it, because it was showing that he was a false prophet. These things never happened, even still to this day, even though that was written in the 70s, like 40 some years ago. I presented it to him. I got a really bad response. First ignoring of my letter to him, and then I met somebody who was a close personal friend of his, and I said, well, this is what happened to me. I'm really stumbled by him. He's not responding to it. And they said, well, I'm going there right now to see him. I'm going to New York. And I said, well, here, let me print this up. And it was written really nicely, and of course, that's when I got a letter from his ministry. Yeah, so I did get the letter the second time, and it just brushed me off like some pat answer. And so this was a real stumbling block to me. If my faith had been in this person as a leader in the Christian community, I could have, I probably would have thrown away the whole idea of Christianity if my faith was based on a person. And if I was a skeptical youth and I got a hold of that and my family was all believing that person, and then I read this, this is where I met a lot of atheists in my ministry having experienced stuff like that, where the people were not being they weren't being honest about the religion and all these contradictions. And so they stumbled. That's why I was so embittered to Christianity, because I experienced those things as a young person, forced to go to church. And I remember one of my friends that I was forced to go to church with, he also became a skeptic for longer than I was, and then I ended up convincing him to be a Christian again. Well, again, he was never a Christian, but he had been forced to go to church. But what I'm saying is, you have these people that are claiming miracles, like David Wilkerson would have claimed, obviously he went in, his story was that he was a preacher from like the Central America somewhere, whatever it was, Central, like mid-America, I should say, not Central America. And he came to New York and just reached out to this gang member and won him over, and risked his life doing it. And so the story of the cross and the switchblade was made a classic, and that's what the title of the book was. And Nicky Cruz was the guy who, so really now after this experience, it makes me question the testimony of that story, just to what degree it was true or not. I don't really trust any of it, nor should anybody when he writes a book, which he never recanted. He never took back that he was mistaken, But he felt like he was led by God to write this, and this is very important that we don't do this. And whether you're a Christian or not, it doesn't really matter where you are at right now. You have to avoid making conclusions before you ought to. That's the kind of the bottom line here. And you need to make careful distinctions between the quality and kind of evidence. So, the latter class, the one of the spiritualist, bears all conceivable marks of being mere human. This prophecy that was 100 years ago, and 100 predictions are made, only one comes true. Well, that makes sense, And then the former is of a divine origin, the one indicating an origin from intelligent omniscience and absolutely infallible, and the other from one most limited and fallible. In all respects, the miracles of Scripture stand in absolute contrast to the so-called mysteries set forth by the advocates of spiritualism. And I know that there are people that can do, incredible things today. There's various healers in Russia, and I've tried to evaluate as much as I can. I mean, generally people are gullible and overbelieving, or disbelieving, and there's no proper, it's not really a middle ground, it's altogether different. Somebody who's just fair-minded. But I think, as far as I've seen, I should say, that all these phenomena are explainable by natural causes. I'm not a cessationalist in the sense of what, like a lot of Baptists believe, that there is no possibility of miracles happening. But I think we need to be careful about our definition of miracles. And I'll probably put a link up of a book on the supernatural that's recommended in this book, written at the same time period by a very good scholar. that goes over some of those subjects in a lot of detail. But I think it's very important that the people are careful. And what I was getting at was that you have these various people. Oh, no, sorry, I'm jumping around too much. What I believe is possible for today is more along the lines that would be like a smaller miracle of providence. So it's a different category of miracles. So in other words, you can have this kind of phenomena happen in answer to prayer or whatever, where your needs are being provided for, where God has promised to take care of you, and you see these things on a daily basis happen to you. You could call that miracles, but I think it's more along the lines of providence, and that's what the last part of this is going to deal with here. It's going to move over into that subject. So we need to be careful what we call miracle, lest we lessen the importance of the divine revelation itself. Again, the miracles were given to such an extent to show mankind that this is the Word of God. And this is God's method of salvation. This is how you find God and develop your relationship with God beyond your knowledge of Him through natural theology, natural events. And then the New Testament needed the same level of demonstration, but it had even more, because it had even with Moses was prophesied to be coming, and he was a type of Christ. But Christ was prophesied to literally thousands of years before he came, and very specifically hundreds of years, in a way that people just never wanted it to be that way either, right? You got to understand that context. They wanted him, even the disciples wanted him to become a political head, and bring in the, military might and restore the ancient theocracy, and that's not, he says, this is not my world. This is not my kingdom, it's a spiritual kingdom. And he was already King of Kings and Lord of Lords, but he has left that to work its way out for the freedom of the will that we all have. So to bring this subject to a still further test, let this class of persons advance to one of our granite mountains, and after making their passes over the surface of the flinty rocks, see if that mountain, at their bidding, will open its sides and send forth floods of water sufficient to quench the thirst of 3 millions of people, together with their countless flocks and herds. Now this is actually, you can see the rock that's split open in Saudi Arabia at the Mountain of God. What's it called again? The locals call it something. Anyway, escapes me for the second. You can actually see the split rock. You can see, this is an area that gets half an inch of water a year. And you can see where the water, the leftover traces of how the water moved on, shaped out the rock, so you could see the water literally flowed out of this point and filled this whole area where they drank from. Because, they had to drink water and bathe and do all this stuff. They needed water. They didn't bathe, they showered. People didn't have bathtubs until the Americans, I think, invented it practically. Not invented it, but the Eastern mindset didn't have baths like that. That's another whole subject I'm not going to get into. Anyway, let these same individuals then approach the Ohio or Hudson River, and making their passes over the same, see if at their bidding the waters thereof will divide and stand in heaps on either side, while the people pass over dry sod and subsequently roll on as before. And finally, let them turn to the sun in the heavens and see if on making their passes over his face, he will stand still for a season and go 10 degrees backwards. Then mediums can perform wonders, even analogous to these. Then and only then their mighty works may claim a rank among those recorded in the Bible. So even we have the prophet where you have all these spiritists and what have you calling upon their gods and wanting this fire to burn, right? And they can't do it. And not only does he pour water over everything, not only does he cause the fire, but he pours water over everything. And the fire not only burns up all the water, but the false prophets as well. So we have these extraordinary, that's the comment I was going to say, extraordinary miracles for extraordinary claims. That's where that statement is true, where it's not that you need extraordinary evidence to believe extraordinary claims, but you want something that is the most important claim for mankind to be given with something that cannot be copied by anybody else. So mere mind reading and that is not that level that can prove a religion, right? So these, okay. So these are showing the creative power. These standing by themselves could not be claimed as miracles and could never, if they did stand thus alone, be appealed as proof for the divine origin of Christianity. It is in this last class exclusively, forms of healing, for example, which may result from miraculous interpositions on the one hand, or from mundane causes on the other, that spiritualism copies or can copy. Let us apply these two classes of facts, the principle of science. Right. Let us apply to these two classes of facts the principle of science, to which we refer in a former part of this treaty, to wit, that when a given class of facts exists, and we know that a part of them is produced exclusively by one given cause, and that this cause is in itself adequate to the production of the whole, and therefore to account for the occurrence, we are bound to refer them in their entireness to that one cause. Of the miraculous events recorded in the Bible, we know absolutely that none of these great central facts can have been the result of any cause but a direct and immediate interposition of creative power, and that this cause is perfectly adequate to account for all the rest. Admitting these facts to have occurred, we are required, therefore, by the universal and immutable principles of science, to ascribe the whole together to this one exclusive cause. Of the facts of spiritualism, on the other hand, we know with equal absoluteness that a part of them are exclusively result of pure mundane causes, and that these causes are perfectly adequate to account for all the rest. So he spent several chapters quoting the spiritualists themselves, saying, well, these things can happen apart from the spirits. So every same phenomena that they admitted happens as proof of the divine origin, or their ability to talk to spirits. They admit that the very exact same things can happen without spirits being present. So there's absolutely no justification to prove the existence. In any case, all of their proofs amount to nothing but proving the mundane theory, which is that these events can happen without a spirit causing them to happen. So that was the main point of the book, so he keeps coming back to that point. By the same principles of science, therefore, we are bound to attribute all these facts to these causes. Thus it is that the facts of spiritualism can be compared to the Bible miracles only on the principle of contrast. That is, the only relation of these two classes of facts or do constain to each other. So it's a contrast, they're not comparable, they're not the same kind, because they do not have actually any evidence for them. All evidence is counteracted by their own testimony. Not that, again, we're not talking about disproving the phenomena that they experience, but what does it prove? It only proves what they themselves admit can be done without spirits. So it took him repeating that over and over again, turning it around, quoting all these testimonies in so much detail to show that the fourth theory is the only true theory. Again, the skeptical theory, which says it's all fake and deliberate deception or mistake, is obviously disproven by all the phenomena itself. The witchcraft theory, which says that it's devils doing it, this is exactly the same context, same area where the spiritualists claim that it's spirits, not devils, which these two contradict each other and cancel each other out, because in the fourth category, the phenomena is real. It can be done, admittedly, by these proponents without the use of devils or... So anyway, that's the point to be established, that by careful consideration of their own testimonies, they actually disprove themselves. And because they're being sloppy, they're not being careful enough to make the proper distinctions. So, and of course, what has happened is people have found so many of them to be liars that they disbelieve the whole thing altogether, which is an overreaction. Okay, so bearings of the previous investigations upon the doctrine of a general and particular providence. Now this is obviously the most important part, so it's probably a video in itself. Maybe I'll divide these up all into individual videos or something. So the idea of very extensively and almost, if not quite universally, obtains at the present time that all effects... Okay, wait. His sentences are very long, so it's hard for the listener to wrap their minds around it, because this is meant to be read and slowly, I guess. And this is the way these guys spoke back then or wrote. Anyway, the idea that is commonly held, right, it's very which is wrong, but the idea of very extensively and almost, if not quite universally, obtains at the present time that all effects of the external universe around us, miracles accepted, occur in perfect accordance with the action of fixed and immutable material laws, right? So this is like almost like deism, like our founding fathers, mostly deistic. It's not quite atheism, but it's the belief that God created the world and set these laws in motion, and they play out, and he kind of sits back and doesn't do anything anymore, and we don't really have... This is the concept that was very entrenched in his day in the Calvinistic system of theology that he was brought up in which he wrote very extensively against throughout his life. Anyway, The idea is that nothing we can do is going to change. It's fatalism, essentially. The laws of nature are fixed, and so this is one of his greatest achievements Mahan did was totally decimate that fatalistic doctrine from many different angles. So here he's just talking about providence. So this is the idea, is immutable material laws. And we deal with this with free energy in the debate. Are we actually creating energy in the sense of violating the laws of thermodynamics or not? And that's where the debate comes, depending on the way you look at it, I suppose. But so that at the creation, every particle of matter had its particular position assigned it relatively to every other, that all subsequent effects in the material universe are the necessary and necessitated result of the mutual action and relations of all such particles, in accordance with the immutable laws of attraction and repulsion, of chemical affinities, and of the vital forces. And that consequently each material event is in a link of chain of necessary causes and effects that can by no possibility, excepting through a miraculous interposition of creative power, be otherwise than it is. Now this is actually the majority doctrine that is held, the belief of almost the entire world. And even of the Christian world, like the Calvinistic types, fatalistic beliefs amount to that really we have no choice. Determinism is locked and set. In our secular culture, it's deterministic, in that we are the product of our environment and about molecules, evolutionary beliefs, so forth. Even Islam doesn't really have a free will in the classical sense. All these Eastern religions essentially believe that it is all a fate, whether it's even a real existence we have or an illusion or whatever. It's all essentially fatalistic. It is only those who believe in the freedom of will, in the Christian sense of the term, that have promoted the Western culture and the idea of natural rights and personal property, the value of personal property, because it's based upon personal identity, and that the individual is a sovereign in themselves. They have creative power over their will. They can turn their hand this way or that way. Unlike an animal who is purely instinctive. The animal is going to do what its instinct dictates. It does not have power. It does not have the freedom of the will, even though people speak otherwise. But most philosophies and religions really hold to the necessarian doctrine of determinism, which we really don't have a choice. However, I will say this. Everybody in the world, unless they're mentally deranged and don't know what they're thinking, everybody in the world on a practical level does not believe that. And that's how I've argued many years now. When you do business, when you go into a court of law, when you do whatever in regular social transactions in life, we all know the truth that we have a freedom of will, and we judge each other accordingly. Why did you do that? Why didn't you do that? It's impossible to think otherwise. And if you get to the point where you don't, that's when we used to take care of people like you, because and you were put on medications because you were a danger to yourself. Because when you get to the point where you can't evaluate those basic things, then there's something really wrong with you. But that's at the core of almost all religion, almost all philosophy, including these so superior ones that are the establishment dictating to us what is real science and what is not, based upon their prestige positions, and telling us that we are all but evolved from some force, even though all the laws of science show otherwise, that left to the chemistry alone, you could never have evolution, you could never have spontaneous generation, you could never have abiogenesis. As I wrote a book on that, by the way. And you cannot have that by their own admission. And nobody wants to talk about that anymore, because the more they look at it, the more they see the proven point on that subject. So you cannot have this be the case. You have to have intelligent design. And yet, nobody wants to hear that. They don't want to be treated as if, in the real world, they don't want to be treated, people don't want to be treated as if they were the result of pure evolution or of their environment. They want to be treated like they are above their former influences, that they have maturity and ability to rise above the circumstances of their upbringing. They shouldn't be treated that way, right? But nevertheless, their philosophy says that. It says that we can't escape that. So which is it? If you consult their philosophy, it's absurd. If you talk to them in the real world, they don't act that way. It's a big contradiction. And so this is another contradiction we're going to find. His point here is to bring out, why do Christians pray? Do they really believe that God answers prayer? For the most part, no. I mean, I've dealt with Christian counseling for a long, long time and talked to thousands of people, and I can tell you that the majority of people, vast majority, do not have any faith in their prayers. That's why they don't pray. You know, it's just a repetition, because this philosophy has constantly been portrayed to them. That God is from a distance watching us, right? And so the idea of it's not Christianity, it's deism. So Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers, actually had a Jefferson Bible where he cut out all the miracles, and he published it that way, as a Jefferson Bible. So he was no Christian, right, at all. For those of you who think the founding fathers were Christian, a lot of them they're deists, you know, Masons and deists, you know, and they were not all Christians. I mean, obviously some of them were, but anyway, they did not believe. They believed in these fixed, immutable laws of nature that cannot be otherwise. But the truth is, God has made us in His image. We all know that we have sovereign ability over our choices. This is what separates us from anything else in creation, any other animal. And we are able to create. And it's not like we create life in that divine sense, which is where the miracles come in to prove God's authority and stamp of approval, as we just talked about. So suppose that with this view distinctly in mind, we are about to kneel in prayer, and that the object of the prayer is to secure the occurrence of some particular event in nature, rain in time of drought, or restoration of the sick friend to health, for example. What effect is this view of the facts of the universe likely to have in exciting or suppressing a spirit of prayer for the objects named? It is a view adapted to excite in us the belief that prayer avails much for the attainment of such objects, and consequently to excite in us sentiments of hope and the exercise of earnest, fervent, and humble, but confiding and persevering impropriety. According to the view before us, the sick man has a certain amount and form of disease from which he can recover, but through a certain process, a process which cannot be shortened or protracted by our mental states. The drought, too, is a necessary result of the combined action of the entire particles of matter constituting the material universe, and must continue till removed by such actions which can be moved in the line of necessary causation. Prayer, however, fervent, can have no avail whatever to secure the result referred to, unless it avails to secure a miraculous interposition of creative power, an event which no one anticipates. In the presence of such a view of the operations of the material universe, the mind can no more have faith in the availing efficacy of prayer to secure such results than it can believe that the same thing can at the same time exist and not exist. This view also, almost of necessity, will extend itself in our minds, from the material over the movements of the moral and spiritual universe. While we regard the one as controlled in all of its movements by fixed and immutable laws of cause and effect, laws the result of which prayer can have no avail to change, we shall hardly fail to regard the moral and spiritual universe as governed by similar laws whose results are equally beyond the availing efficacy of prayer. So there's no, if it's everything is fixed, then our prayers are meaningless, or just the result of being forced to pray. And in that case, why do we blame anybody for anything? Why do we get upset if it's all determined? Anyway, prayer in the presence of such view of the material, moral, and spiritual universe may remain as a mere form, and in no other state can it well remain. It will not avail to change these results, to inform us that God, foreseeing at the beginning the prayer of his people, arranged the current of events so that they should accord in important particulars with prayer. From the nature of the case, such an arrangement could reach such contingent events, but in a very general and limited manner. It is in itself also a view of providence in no way adapted to call forth effectual and fervent prayer. For specific results, the form of which prayer generally ought to assume, the actual results of this view of providence are precisely accordant with the above presentation. Prayer made for any such results as we are speaking of is, and no more will deny the fact, little more than a form, and as a form even, it exists to the very limited extent. The spirituality of the church is, in our solemn judgment, being spoiled through philosophy. So this was the philosophy of Plato, which, I mean, I'm speaking in real general terms here, influenced Augustine, who was really like a Neoplatonist, and Origen and many other founding fathers, which were, centuries after, the early church, and which have snuck in, as was told in the scriptures would happen. Destructive heresies and false doctrines would come in and cripple those who profess to be Christians into this fatalism, which is kind of this vague view, of the matter. Because it's self-contradictory, and you'll have people saying one thing on the one hand and another thing the opposite on the other. It's not consistent. But this has been going on for years. And of course, it is also in the non-Christian circles as well. As I said, determinism is in almost every religion at the basis of it in one way or another, despite how people live from day to day and how they judge each other. If we turn from this cold and cheerless view of providence to the scriptures, we find not only a want of correspondence, but a total and irreconcilable opposition between it and the most positive teaching on the subject. According to such teaching, God is ever with us and a very present help in trouble, perplexity and want, able and ready to respond by specific providences to our individual and specific necessities and filial requests, and that equally in regard to the demands of our physical and spiritual natures. All alike stand revealed as equally appropriate objects of prayer, objects in respect to which special and specific answers are alike and equally to be anticipated. There could be no doubt on this subject. If we retire from the Bible and the philosophy of providence under consideration into the depths of our own moral and spiritual being, we shall find every principle and demand of that nature in fixed and immutable correlation to the former and the opposition to the latter view of providence. So again, implied in what he's saying there is he's got many books on the subject of holiness, and that God has provided an answer for every single need that we have in life. So this is very, very important and relates to this subject matter today. We wander through nature in a state of cheerless orphanage till God is present to us in all the movements of providence, in the very parental and special relations revealed in the scriptures. Now we take the ground that the real providence of God in the movements and material creation accord with the teaching of the higher philosophy revealed through the scriptures and the moral and spiritual nature of humanity, and not with the teaching of material philosophy before us, a philosophy which we shall see has taken into account but a part of the material forces in nature, and therefore fundamentally errs in the teaching pertaining to the procedures and laws of divine providence in the material universe. So, we have a very important distinction here that he is making in science, a grand category differentiation between the normal cause and effect relationship of the material universe, in which things happen as a chain reaction, and an interruption of that, constant interruption, by this force itself, which is allowing for willpower. And that's what I'm calling it. I think it would have been, if that term was even popular in that day, which I'm not sure, I don't think it was, it would have been probably more appropriate than to use odelic force, but willpower interrupts that, is the freedom of the will. There is no cause and effect causing this to happen here in the form of a material cause and effect. There's a material cause and effect after my volition, my willpower animates the trigger in my body that can trigger a chain reaction, the nerve impulses and the chemical reactions that take place are triggered in a chain of events. So we're not setting aside the cause and effect relationships by this theory, or the science, I should say. But we were saying that there is no deterministic factor for my hand moving back and forth, and even for the words that I'm saying here. I am not doing this as a result of molecular chemistry action exclusively. And so again, a failure to distinguish between, to make careful distinctions, leads to the reductionistic, oversimplistic, naive, contrary to universal consciousness knows otherwise, that that is not the case, and we judge each other accordingly. Like I said, why would we get upset? Why do not materialistic philosophers and deterministic philosophers of all sorts just come to grips with the fact that nobody can help what they're doing? Why do we act like they shouldn't do something? You know, and that's where it leads to people saying there should be no such thing as punishment, but reformation, reforming somebody, because it's just really they're a product of their environment, and we need to create a different environment. But see, that's all fine and dandy to say, but in real life, when somebody wrongs them, they perceive that that person is evil, and they know that they ought not to have done it. And this is where there's an inconsistency in actual real life. So what we have here is a very important distinction between the mechanicalistic aspects of creation and the creative. And free energy may some free energy systems may play into that as well, where we override by a creative force regular processes to create the nonlinear reactive processes, which some may call creation of energy. I mean, ultimately, most people will agree that, who believe in free energy, that all the energy was there already, in a sense. It's just kind of a reorganization. So it still really falls under the category of a open system, or even within a closed system. When you think of really how the universe is it really so closed? Or sorry, are there the various energy domains that people put around a closed system, are they really being accurate in defining those lines? Or really are we in a lot more open environment? Anyway, for those of you who are following me because of energy, which is probably almost everybody, that's why I bring these things up. But I think the creative aspect of our being, which is where we have the freedom of will, the decision-making seat in us, violates that and blows to the water all these claims of absolute determinism. It goes against everything we perceive. So it's a mere fiction. It's a mere fantasy, and it's used to actually justify selfishness, or the wanting to create your own reality. It's moral evasion. Now this will force, the odelic force, or willpower, what's involved in willpower, I should probably say more clearly, has, as we have seen, not only pervades the human organism, but all nature too, and through it, as we have seen, when the proper conditions are fulfilled, the most astonishing effects may be voluntarily and intentionally produced upon surrounding objects. We will, for example, that the hands of individual in magnetic connection with us shall be immovably fastened to the table of other objects, and or their fingers shall remain interlocked so that they cannot draw them asunder, and these results, all possible efforts of those individuals to the contrary withstanding, these results, we say, follow in accordance with our wills. So he had talked about many stories where these skeptics and people went in there to these meetings with mediums and what have you, people who were not mediums, who had this ability, and they held on to the legs of these tables, like these big tables, and the medium or a person would put their hands above the table if they even had to do that. And then this table would follow them around. And they had, like, in some of these stories, two strong men trying to pull the table the opposite and then being pulled along. And of course, these are wooden tables. There's no metal inside of them. And these are people that just don't believe, this is all fakery. And they're trying to figure this out. And then seeing it again and again, become believers in it. Not that they believe in spirits after that. They realize that, But anyway, so here we have this table being lifted up, being dragged across the room, all these different phenomena happening, this rapping on the wall, an answer to questions in kind of Morse code fashion, responding to various questions being asked. However, being responded to according to what's already in the minds of those who are asking the questions. And so not necessarily implying that there's a spirit, obviously not having to have that case. But so here we have this ability taking place. Either these events were the result of direct miraculous interpositions, or there is in all nature around us the very force of which we are speaking, a force through which such voluntary results may be produced. The facts themselves, the reality of which cannot be denied, admitting of no other explanation, is a first and universal principle of science, that the government of God over the material universe, that being the only department of creation of which we are speaking now, shall accord with the nature of all the forces actually existing therein. Right? If there are, and none doubt the fact of their existence, forces in nature which act in fixed and immutable accordance with the laws of attraction, repulsion, chemical affinity, etc., then we would expect to find a class of events like the movements of the heavenly bodies, for example, events which move on in changeless antecedents and consequence, and which prayer can never avail to alter. So there's two categories of fixed and immutable events. And some people claim that the laws of non-conservation of energy are of that class. It's kind of hard to prove that, but that may be. If, on the other hand, there is in nature another and different force, a will force, will force, of immense power and influence over all other material objects, a force whose action is controlled by mental states and directed by the same, then the immutable laws of science would require us to suppose that another class of effects are continuously occurring around us. Effects which are the result of successive and immediate acts of divine volition through this very force. Effects immediately produced as existing and special exigencies require, and which are no more to be regarded as miracles than the other class referred to. As thus, acting in and controlling nature, God would never be present to us as accessible by prayer, and as the immediate and special rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. It's very, very important. Healing mercies, rain in times of drought, sunshine in long continued storms, and present helps in all times of trouble might be expected in answer to special prayer. And this without the mind being chilled and repelled from a throne of grace by the idea of a mutable concatenation of causes and effects throughout nature, a concatenation which nothing but miracles can avail to break or to alter, miracles which no one believes prayer would avail to secure in our behalf. To this view of providence, a view in accordance with which special prayer for specific blessings may receive specific answers through events which would not otherwise have occurred at all, and this without miracles, and in perfect accordance with God's ordinary method of controlling events in the world around us. To this one view of providence, we say, a view which accords with the entire teachings of inspiration on the subject and the immutable demands of a moral and spiritual nature, philosophy itself, we believe, is now advancing, and has backtracked obviously from since. And the faith of the Church will ere long not be spoiled through philosophy, but confirmed by its teachings. And this is why I spent so much time trying to produce these teachings once again, which have been long lost in the world today. The proposition that God governs the universe not by special but by general laws, we utterly disbelieve when presented as the exclusive view of providence. We equally repudiate the universal position that he governs the universe not by general but by special laws. We think that in the order of providence, both principles are harmoniously blended. I'm getting tired here. Events failing exclusively under the first class of the laws are not objects of prayer and are never so presented in the scriptures. Those, on the other hand, falling under the second class are such objects, events the current of God, of which God, without miracles, may, in the exercise of his sovereign wisdom and love, continuously vary in adaptation to the continuously varying necessities and filial requests of his creatures, just as the acts of an earthly parent may vary to meet the ever-changing wants and affectionate petitions of his children. This view of providence, which certainly accords with the teachings of inspiration and demands of our moral and spiritual natures, will yet, we think, stand revealed as the only one which philosophy itself permits. So there we have the end result. Well, before I go on, I would like to say I'm sorry that I couldn't make this shorter, but I had to cover the subject in that depth in order to give it justice. And I think I covered it pretty thoroughly upon the ground which I needed to cover. But there we have the final point, which brings some perspective to this phenomena that we can see happen. We can be having a relationship with God that's really dynamic and interactive. And this is very special. This is a different kind of proof in the life of the believer that is after the fact. This is where, if you have loving parents that you grew up with, which most people don't have these days, but if you did, and you had your parent take care of you in that relationship, you could then perceive that you could have a possible relationship with God in that way. And with your parents, do you have a relationship that was so cause and effect and so rigid that there was nothing that they would ever do for you but by brute force? No. And the causes are not greater than the effects are not greater than their causes. And obviously we have the Creator being not just like us, but more than us and better than us. And we can have that dynamic relationship where we can have we can depend upon, it's very important, like his last point there, that we can really depend upon the expectation of the repetition of the natural universe, where we can know that the sun's going to shine tomorrow. I mean, of course, not in Michigan, but we can count on the sun shining we can count on the food that we eat is going to be safe for us and not change tomorrow. That's very important. But we can also count upon the slight changes of things that need to happen to take care of our basic needs, that he can fulfill that promise. The promises of God are very, very unique and abundant, and they cover all of our needs. And more importantly than our physical, our needs, our spiritual needs can be completely met. And so this is very important, that we can have this dynamic relationship with God. And it's not portrayed that way. Maybe because there's so very few people in the world today that are truly spiritual, that we have precious little example of such a life of faith where people are living and experiencing that in a way that they have answered prayers. And in the backdrop of that, we have so many false professors that say they have answered prayers, and they're a bunch of hypocrites and liars. Or they overbelieve everything that happens to them. Like you have these people that are prosperity gospel, and they're very rich people, and yeah, sure, they have their needs taken care of because they're physically been prosperous. And so they think, oh, well, God has blessed it because I'm prosperous. Well, God has blessed people equally who are not religious at all. So obviously that cancels out that proof. But the point is, there's a great many people that do disservice to this by making false claims and basically cheapen the idea of this life of faith by seeing into everything. Just like some people see a devil around every corner, other people say, the Lord did this and the Lord told me that and this and that, and they become very irritating to almost everybody around them, except those who are their friends who are doing the same thing, because they're so self-deceived. It's a mockery to real religion. It's abhorrent to witness. It's disgusting, and we all know people like that, whether you're religious or not. So this does a disservice to people, to the cause of God and of true religion. But know this is my testimony. I've shared quite a bit of testimonies here. Know this, that I know that there's answers to prayer, and I know how to walk with God and experience these things, and that He is faithful, to do that. And there was one other story I was going to tell. I can say a couple examples of answers to prayer that I had. I remember one time there were very striking answers to prayer beyond the more general providential answers to prayer. But I was very poor when I used to live down in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, as a visitor to this country before I immigrated here. And I would go back and forth and help people volunteering at this church in Pennsylvania. And one time I came back, I was a mechanic, and I used to carry all the tools that I could rebuild an engine with in my back of my car, my old Rabbit. And so one time I actually needed it. Well, I was going up this 2-mile mountain. I was on an incline, and I didn't know it. I didn't think about it at the time, but the head in my car overheated, and what happened was the head gasket opened up by that warping, and all this engine oil poured in, and it just fed it like fuel. And it was so hot that it was like, my car just took off like a rocket. It was like a Porsche suddenly, a Volkswagen to Porsche in seconds. And of course, I knew what happened. I didn't think about the whole purpose, because it would have changed the whole story if I thought it through more carefully. But anyway, I instantly knew that that was happening, that the gas or the fuel was pouring, the oil was pouring in. I just thought it was cracked, right? I thought the head was cracked. I thought it was permanently damaged, or that the gasket was blown. Sorry, that's what I thought it was. So I thought, okay, so I instantly threw my car into lower gear and it stalled it out because it was capable of driving me right off the highway. It was just so crazy. Anyway, that wasn't any miracle or anything. That was just what happened. And so then I'm in the middle of nowhere, and I had a series of answers to the prayer of getting picked up, and it was quite an event. It wasn't anything miraculous in that sense, but it was still providential. God took care of me. And I had to get back to work. I was a security guard at the time, and I needed to get back to my shift. And I made my way into town, which was 30 miles away, like on foot. And I got picked up a couple times, and I ordered the part, and I made my way back to sleep in my car because I had no money at the time. I gave all my money to everybody else. And so I ordered the head gasket, made my way back to the car, and got there and slept there in my car. And then I had to go back into town the next day. But it was raining like crazy. And it was at that time of the year too. And it just wasn't stopping. And the clouds were dark here and there, you know. There was no prospect of it stopping. And so I prayed, you know, in the morning I, you know, read the Bible and pray, and people call devotions and that. And so I prayed, and I said, Lord, I'll need to go after I'm done here, and I need the rain to stop, you know. And I was very particular about that. And the whole time I was reading and praying, it just was not letting up. And it was raining extremely hard, like I'm talking about buckets of water. And that's what happens at that time of the year in that area. I mean, it's just like, it's not like even a car wash. It's just like buckets of water. You can't drive in that. It's so bad. So even if I got out, I wasn't going to be getting any hitchhike because there's nobody with me driving. It was that bad. And so I literally, in faith, put my hand down to open the door. And as soon as I touched the door, because that was an act of faith, I put my hand on the door, and it instantly stopped. And it cleared up, and it didn't rain until I, again, found my way to have people help me get back to the parts store and get my way back again with the head gasket. And I had all the tools already in the back of my car. And it didn't rain. I got my way back, and just on top of the world after that experience, and just beaming about it, that the rain had stopped, right? And it was like far too coincidental that at that exact second, it just stopped, and it remained stopped. So I get back, I actually changed the head gasket, and this is a diesel Rabbit, so it's a lot more involved, or you have to be a lot more careful with the diesel than a gas head, and you got the timing to deal with. And I actually did it faster than I would have in the shop, and I got it done really quickly. Just started literally closing down the door of the hood of my car, put my tools away, and the police officer comes up and said, "Do you need any help?" I was like, "No, you're a little late, but I'm fine now." And so I'm driving down the highway, And so after, about half an hour, I want to make sure that everything's okay. So I stop, look, everything's okay, close the hood. And then it starts to rain after that. And I get home and everything's fine. What I did realize though, think about, not to detract from the whole experience, was that if I had let my rabbit sit, the engine cool off, then I probably could have got home and it would have been no problem, because the gasket wasn't blown. What had happened was it just became so hot, the engine, that it opened up so that the oil could flow through. And so really with the heat, it just was overheating to the point where the fuel was coming, because that happened at a different time again with the new gasket. But hey, it was worth happening to experience that. And it's just not, it's not merely that, you can say, well, that Rick wasn't, it was a coincidence, I don't believe in miracles, whatever. You're just naive in believing it. I mean, I'm telling you the bare bones of the story, and I have a life of experiencing things like that. Not so dramatic necessarily, but the point is that you can learn to be content, and I'm not suggesting that people learn to be content with delusions, because that's a serious problem to delude yourself with false realities. But I have learned to be content in all circumstances. I mean, I've been through the worst of it. I've had the most horrific things happen to me in my life, and just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I've had worse things happen to me. But knowing that you have a faithful Father that takes care of you and can provide for your needs, not spare you trials, but allow you to have trials so that you can have greater blessings because of those trials, and that you can bless other people, more importantly. Because who am I in my personal trials when I could bless maybe thousands of other people with persevering through those trials, like Job? And that's what I talked about in a previous video a couple of years ago, where Job and all these others went through so many trying circumstances, like Joseph, and for years, and then was able to come out with it, on top of it, and be able to do so much more for God with that experience, and to bless so many more people over the centuries and millennium. And so that's where, these experiences, your experience produces more faith and expectation and rest, the rest of faith, which is a title that Mahan wrote, one of the books that I'll be publishing as well. Anyway, I hope this, I don't want anybody to be tempted to dabble in occultic things out of curiosity. He had a whole chapter upon the bad influences, subjecting yourself to mindlessness, letting go, putting yourself into trance states is extremely dangerous. And I don't have all the answers for answering all these questions that people would have about it. I'm really at the beginning of this subject matter, not in relation to prayer, but just in relation to the whole science of this force. But I encourage very much caution. Acknowledge what's real, but don't always just jump into something just because it is possible. And of course, be aware that there are manipulators out there that are reading your minds. Oh, and this is one point that he made in the book. So the way they proved this out was putting thoughts into their head deliberately, like asking questions and having them answered according to what was revealed in their own minds. So they would say truthful things in their minds, or they would not say things, they would just think. Like they would ask a question about their mother who had passed away, and they would be thinking about their mother in a truthful way or in the actual way, and then they would just, while this person is relaying all this information that's coming out, they would think other thoughts, and these would come out as well. And so some of these things were rather silly. Go tell this person to go get oysters from the kitchen or something. All these kind of testimonies. So just because somebody has the ability to read somebody's mind, just like a lie detector, they could never be accurate, because the thoughts in somebody's head could be random. We all know our thoughts. They could be all over the place. And just like a lie detector can't determine whether somebody is lying or not just because of their response, because they could respond the exact same way from dreading the thought of someone thinks that they're lying. Right? And the foremost experts on lying have shown that you cannot trust, that there's no such thing as a lie detector. There's only something that shows you particular stimulus that you can have from a variety of reasons. So in the same way, if somebody can read somebody's mind, this is no authoritative proof of any new truth or the truthfulness of the affirmation. All it proves is that this person can read your thoughts. And so that doesn't amount to proving somebody as authoritative or that they should be counseled with. Because do you really want somebody who's digging into your own thoughts just telling you what you want to hear? Maybe some people do. And they don't really care. They just want the attention, maybe. I don't know. But I think that there's an aspect to this, as we looked at the positive aspect, there's an aspect to this where God answers prayer and for good that is in relation to this force, and that it influences other people for good, but there's also a way that it can be bad. And that's what I talked about earlier in the cursing, that people are cursed by implanted thoughts in their head or whatever, or the extreme of this where somebody is made completely not only brainwashed, but they're put into a trance in a state where they exercise the will of somebody else and are not even aware of it. And what is it where they had movies like that where some president had become what do they call it? Starts with an M. Anyway, the president was controlled by another, and this is what a lot of conspiracy theorists, get into with the whole MK Ultra and all that programming, where how much of that is true and how much is not. It's hard to say with any conspiracy, but there's a lot of belief that many people are programmed to do different things at the right time, and they're in a sense a patsy. I mean, initially they've gone, I guess the whole Bourne Identity and Treadstone TV show kind of concept is along those lines, where they're just reactivated and someone's messed with their mind. So, obviously you're going to get in the entertainment world all the drama, and things aren't going to be always realistic. But the fact is that people can read minds and they can control other people who have willingly given themselves up. To what extent, I have no idea. And I'm sure that the powers that be have this long figured out and used to their advantage, just like we saw in MK Ultra type of experiments, to see how people's psychic abilities and what. So I think today, when you have, like, working in mental health, I would say, and I worked with people that were extremely violent on heavy medications. Now, I had no say in the matter whether they could come off of medications, but I was there, helped them. In this one particular home, before I was there, before they were on medications, they were running away, and then the police would be bringing them home after they caused a fight and whatever. So, strangely enough, that these people were allowed to live in a group home, because there was a big change when I got into the field 25 years ago, where they tried to push towards group homes instead of being in the institutions. But you have people today, no doubt, that are just locked up. People that have abilities or don't have the regular abilities. They're just locked up. And I guess you're going to see more of this if you go to San Francisco and see the people, homeless people. You're probably going to see more and more examples of that, where it's uncontrolled. People are messed up. They've been, so when you engage in that, again, referring to another Hollywood production of Limitless, when you take the pill more, it ruins you more and more, and so when you exercise mindlessness and you open yourself up to this kind of stuff in an inappropriate way, it can ruin you, no doubt, ruin your mind. So we always need to be in self-control, but in some sense or another, we have these experiences, we can't even avoid them. We shouldn't ever seek to manipulate others with these things, but we can pray and see God interact in our real world. Now, when I looked at the Keto book, they talk about maintaining that self-control and never getting into a state of complete passivity. But that state of complete passivity is what many religions and groups call for, to be let totally go and allow yourself. And so hypnotism is very much that way, where you give yourself over to this person who is going to control your mind. And of course they justify it, but I don't see that as proper under any circumstances to do. You can say, well, medically it helps. This is something that is very dangerous to do. So, but it's real. It's a rather common practice. It's no longer, like Wikipedia says, and people resort to that in desperation, I suppose. But anyway, I hope this covered the subject. I don't think I'm going to get into it anytime soon again. That's why this is so long. I'm doing this because I'm doing this for my sake too, in this study. I thought I would announce the book will be available if people want to order it. Of course, all the books are online for free viewing already. But if you want to have a printed copy, which is true to the original, I'll be producing that. I'm not sure how soon, but it's almost done with the editing of it. But eventually we'll be trying to do the complete series, these are 2 volumes. Well, I've got 4 volumes here of ASA Mahan's series, Critical History of Philosophy, one of the 4 most important books that I've ever read, and probably ever will read. The Science of Natural Theology. This is one of the spiritual books, Out of Darkness into Light, kind of his spiritual journey. And then I've got many others, including individual sermons and lectures also that I've done over the last 25 years, putting on my websites, and before the internet too, I was making those available. So I highly recommend these works. I realize the reason why this video is so long is because people want to listen, they don't want to read anymore, and it's not always easy reading of some of these philosophy books, and that's why I'll be working over the next 2 years to bring and make more contemporary language curriculum to these works, where as I work through them once again from the ground up, I will try and process them into a more concise 2,000-page book of the fundamentals of the mental and spiritual side of our being, and then followed by a physical side. So instead of having so many volumes, I'm going to try and bring them down to these essential points, and we'll see how that goes. May not happen. So, but anyway, I hope this has been enjoyable. Give me a like if you like it. If you don't, just don't give me a dislike. I don't really care. Whatever. People are going to dislike it anyway. So we'll see if this becomes one or many videos. So thanks for watching.